Welcome, everyone. This is Mr. Simone from Flora Park Memorial, and I'm here for our video overview of the Watergate Scandal. It's going to take me some time to get through this, so let's get started right away. First of all, let's define what Watergate is. Watergate really has two definitions. First of all, it is that apartment complex that you are looking at right now. And in 1972, the Democratic National Committee's headquarters were located in this apartment complex called the Watergate. But it also refers to a series of scandals that were uncovered during the Nixon administration around the time of this presidential election. Those of you that are familiar with the movie Forrest Gump, there is a scene where he is in a hotel and he calls the front desk, letting them know that somebody has a flashlight and they're looking around. They might have lost their keys. He puts the phone down and it says Watergate. So it's all about this man, Richard Nixon. So who was Richard Nixon? Well, first of all, in 1934, he graduated second in his class from Whittier College in California, where he did play football. You might be interested to know, he turned down Yale, which he was accepted to, because his family could not afford the lofty tuition even at that time. He then went on to Duke Law School, where he graduated, I believe, third in his class. So obviously a very impressive academic resume. At the young age of 31, he was elected to the House of Representatives from California. You have to be 25, by the way, to run for the House. It's 25 for the House, 30 for the Senate, and 35 for the presidency. And he had a very distinguished career early on in the House of Representatives. He was a member of a group called HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a committee that was investigating spies during the Cold War who were working for the Russians. Probably the most well-known was Alger Hiss, who he was able to convince the country that he was working for the Russians. Then in 1950, he became a senator from California, and he defeated Helen Douglas. I just learned this during my studies. She was actually in a secret affair with LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, who was Speaker of the House at the time. And Nixon had accused Douglas of being a communist sympathizer during his Senate election. So that really, those two things, being a member of HUAC, being a member of the Senate, catapults him to become Dwight Eisenhower's vice presidential nominee in 1952. But at that time, you may see a nice little dog put down here, Nixon was accused of a few, let's just say, improper financing deals. And at the time, a lot of people in the Republican Party said Nixon should resign. He did not resign, or I should say he should drop out of the ticket to be the VP. And he gave a speech in which he said, "I've never accepted an illegal gift and never taken a bribe. The only gift I've ever received is this, my dog Checkers, and I'm not giving her back." And the people were, they believed him, and as a result of the Checkers speech, Nixon was able to stay on the ticket. One of my former students once notified me that Checkers is actually buried in a dog cemetery in Wantagh, New York. I don't know why. Okay, so now he serves 2 terms as Eisenhower's VP, and he goes to run for president in 1960, running against JFK in a hotly contested election in which JFK defeated Nixon very narrowly. It was the first time they had a televised debate in the presidential election, which some people think helped JFK. And there's also some rumors that Kennedy's people may have bugged Nixon's room before the first debate. That's important to know. And there's also allegations that Kennedy's people voted illegally for dead people in Chicago, switching the tide of the Illinois electoral vote. Okay, so at that time, Nixon was really obviously disappointed and decides to run for the governor's seat of California. And this position was a very important one, but it did lead to Nixon's defeat. And at that time, after losing that race to Governor Pat Brown, he basically told people, you're not going to have Nixon to, I forget the phrase, but pick up and much longer, and pick on much longer, and he said he was done with politics. But he was not done with politics because in 1968, he became the Republican nominee for president, and this was a hotly contested seat for him. He was up against George Romney. I'm not sure if you know who Mitt Romney was, one of our recent presidential nominees, but this was Mitt Romney's father. Mitt Romney was the frontrunner for the Republican nomination until he said that he was brainwashed into supporting the Vietnam War, which he was ridiculed for. So then it came down to Nixon, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and Ronald Reagan. And Reagan actually had more total votes going into the convention, but not enough to clinch it. That's some political knowledge I need to provide you with later on. So Nixon was able to win the convention and get the nomination for the Republican Party. He defeated Hubert Humphrey. That was a Democratic chaotic situation with the Chicago Democratic Convention. I hope you watched that in the Vietnam video. But in 1968, you have the anti-war people, the pro-war Vietnam people, and Humphrey came out on top. But Nixon defeated Humphrey in 1968. Okay, so that gives you enough background on Nixon. A little bit longer than I wanted to. I apologize. So now, during Nixon's presidency, there is a top secret document called the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers was about 7,000 pages, and it was documenting the U.S. policies during the Vietnam War. Now, this was not when Nixon was president. This was under Truman, and then Eisenhower, and then Kennedy, and finally Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was not flattering to the U.S. government. Failed policies, lying to the American people. Remember, the Vietnam War was a civil war between the North and South that started well before we got involved. There was a former member of the Defense Department, Daniel Ellsberg. This is young Daniel Ellsberg, and that's today Daniel Ellsberg. Yes, he's still alive, who leaked these papers to the New York Times. And the Supreme Court was now going to decide whether or not this was legal. The Nixon administration did not want the Pentagon Papers to be released. They actually broke into and burglarized the psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg. I hope I got that right. So Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office was broken into, trying to get dirt on him. And this group will become known as the plumbers that are trying to prevent all sorts of leaks. Anyway, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the New York Times could publish the papers, and that's the end of the Pentagon Papers story. Okay, so now Nixon is getting ready for re-election. So here's where Watergate really begins. In July of 1972, 5 men were arrested. They were caught breaking into the Watergate complex for the National Democratic Committee. And at the time, it was not a major story. The break-in, it was a fleeting. I think I read somewhere where only like 48% of the country even knew that it happened. I'll tell you who some of the burglars were later on, but we're now going to just go to the election. And during the election, he's running against George McGovern, but that was not who he thought he was going to be running against. This man right here, his name is Edmund Muskie. He was from Maine, and he was the Democratic frontrunner. Now, what did the Nixon campaign do to Edmund Muskie? They thought he was a greater threat, so they didn't want him to win the nomination. So the first thing they did is they robocalled people, and they said that, did you know that Muskie used a racial slur to describe Americans who were French Canadian? Okay, so that upset people early on in the primary season. These are the dirty tricks that were used by the Nixon campaign. The next thing they did is they got Edmund Muskie's taxi driver or chauffeur to spy on him. So they actually paid him $25,000, I believe, to give them information on Edmund Muskie. So Muskie loses the nomination, George McGovern wins it, and McGovern was seen as a more ultra-liberal candidate, whereas Muskie was seen as more moderate, and Nixon's people thought it would be easier to beat McGovern. They were right. Look at that map. All the red are the states that Nixon won, and the only ones that Muskie won were only one, Massachusetts, he also did win Washington, D.C., which we know is not a state. So the election is a landslide. And some people say, why would he have cheated if Nixon even knew about it? Why would they have cheated if it was an election that was such a runaway? Okay, well, this is the slide that's probably going to blow your mind here a little bit. All right, so these are all the different people who were involved in the Watergate scandal. And I don't expect you to remember all of them. You may not remember any of them, although there's one that's still around, pretty prominent today. That's that John Dean right here. And all of these people, in one way or another, are involved in the scandal. Now, I will say early on, there was a Democratic representative, Wright Patman, just learned this summer, who really made a major effort to investigate all of this money that was on the bodies of the burglars. But he really couldn't get much traction in Congress. People didn't want to listen to him. So there was somebody early on that thought this was a bigger story than most people believed. So now you have all of these men. So you got James McCord, that's one of the burglars. I would say E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. Those are the masterminds, the plumbers trying to prevent all the leaks. These are the people that are working for Nixon. You have Haldeman, who was his chief of staff. You have John Ehrlichman, who was his chief advisor for domestic affairs. Please keep in mind John Dean, the White House counsel. The other people, and John Mitchell, you should know. He was his former attorney general, who later became the director of CREEP. Now, CREEP is the Committee to Re-elect the President. So that's the whole group that was dedicated to this effort. So where the story gets interesting is because of the work of these two men. This is them in the 1970s, and this is them today. They're both alive. This is Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they were two reporters working for the Washington Post. And they had a secret informant who was leaking information to them about all of these scandals, meaning that there was hush money, that they were using the IRS to intimidate people for not paying their taxes properly, that they had an enemies list. So they're getting all this information, and at a time where most people were not really interested in the Watergate affair, Woodward and Bernstein refused to give up. Now, the secret informant went by the name Deep Throat at the time. His identity was kept secret all the way until 2005, when this 90-something-year-old guy, Mark Felt, told the public that he was actually Deep Throat, and his position at the time was second in command at the FBI. So he clearly had tremendous information that was used accordingly. Okay, so now I'm going to go back here. I'm just going to tell you that they start in 1973 to hold Senate hearings. So at the beginning, it was led by a Democrat from North Carolina, Sam Ervin. He's down below. And then basically one of the burglars, James McCord, wrote to the judge and told him that the White House had bribed him to keep quiet. So that's kind of like the tip of the iceberg, and now they're starting to realize that, there was at least a cover-up. Then in April, Haldeman, down here, and Ehrlichman, and the Attorney General, who I don't have on this, well, yes I do, Richard Kleindienst, they all resigned. And then John Dean was fired. So now you're seeing huge turnover in the Nixon campaign. And Nixon gave a speech that night in April that he said he will personally investigate the matter, and there should be no illegality in his administration. The Senate hearings were really focused primarily on the cover-up payments. So you have this guy, Jeb Magruder, who's involved with CREEP. He was implicating many people, including his boss, who was John Mitchell at the time, who was the head of CREEP. So again, I'm not going to ask you to remember all of this, but just be aware that a lot of this it's like follow the money, and where was the illegal activity taking place. But then John Dean gives his testimony, and by the way, this was on all summer long, interrupted all the soap operas at the time. So now John Dean gives his testimony. He claims that the president was involved in the cover-up. He also said that the White House used the IRS and campaign funds improperly, and he told them about the enemies list, and he said that they were surveying and they were bugging various politicians. But John Mitchell says that he does not agree with John Dean and said that the president had no knowledge of any of this. But then, okay, so if I've lost you for the last 3 minutes, I need to bring you back. This guy right here, Alexander Butterfield, he's the surprise witness, just a White House aide, and he says that there are tape recordings in the Oval Office, that everything that's gone on in Nixon's office has been tape recorded. So now we have a major story. And as if that's not enough, please be aware that the vice president, in an unrelated story in the same year, Spiro Agnew, he resigns because of illegalities while he was governor of Maryland. And he's replaced by Gerald Ford, and that will be very important for you to understand. Have that here. So Spiro Agnew is out as vice president, took bribes while he was governor of Maryland. So now they hire a special prosecutor to really investigate all of this work, and his name is Archibald Cox. But Nixon wants him fired. So he tells his attorney general, Elliot Richardson, to fire him. Elliot Richardson refuses, so then Nixon fires him. Then he asks William Ruckelshaus to fire Archibald Cox. He refuses, so he's gone, he resigns. Then he asks the next in command, Robert Bork, and he did not want to do it, but eventually he does, and this becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre, and he's replaced by Leon Jaworski. Okay, but we're still in need of a discussion about the tapes. So where does this lead us? Well, when they decide to hand over the tapes, the first thing they do is they hand over transcripts of the tapes. And Nixon refuses to give over all of them. He cites his executive privilege, saying that I do not need to hand them over. I'm the president, and there's top secret information on there. But the Supreme Court rules against him. 8-0, the Supreme Court in the United States versus Nixon says he must hand over the tapes. I hope one of you might be thinking, why is it 8-0? And I'm here to tell you that I'm glad you're thinking that. There are 9 people in the Supreme Court, but one of them, William Rehnquist, formerly worked in the Nixon administration, so he recused himself from the decision. So when they finally hand over all of the tapes, first of all, there's 18 and a half minutes missing from one of them. And Nixon's secretary, who is right here, Rosemary Woods, she claimed that while she was picking up the phone, she pressed her foot on the wrong button, and that activated the tape recording, which lasted for 18 and a half minutes, erasing over the original stuff on the tape. Are you guys at all familiar with how old tapes used to work? If not, ask, the old person like me in class. But the smoking gun tape was a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman, which basically implicates the president in the cover-up. Now, that doesn't mean that he ordered the break-in. That we were never able to prove, but rather than face impeachment, Nixon decided to resign on August 9th, 1974, and please be aware that when he resigns, Gerald Ford, the man he selected to be his next vice president, is going to become president, and he gives Nixon a full pardon. So that's a decent job, hopefully, on my part. And what we're going to talk about in class is what are some of the key issues that are raised as a result of the Watergate scandal. But I'm not going to talk about that now because that's where your questioning and curiosity and inquisitive nature is going to come in. So I have no idea how long that was. I hope it all made sense to you, and I will see you all in class. Take care.